we started with a moment's silence for what's happening in Gaza. The killing of people on October the 7th was wrong and appalling. That act of terror that took lives of 1,400 people. Israel's response of bombing in Gaza has now taken 11,000 lives. Just as I was coming here this morning, I heard that the Israeli Armed Forces, the IDF, has instructed everyone to leave Al-Shifa Hospital within 1 hour. A hospital, everybody's got to go. There's nowhere to go, and told them to go westwards towards the beach. This is unbelievable. We're watching in real time the destruction of life, the destruction of what passes for a public service system in Gaza, and more killing is going on. When the General Secretary of the United Nations says there is disaster, there is famine, there is death coming even worse to Gaza now, surely to goodness every government in the world should recognize that and say to Israel, stop, make sure there is a ceasefire that can bring about a long-term peace and a long-term justice. You can invade, you can control, you can kill, you can maim, but the bitterness goes on for decades and decades and decades. Peace is never easy to achieve. You've got to start somewhere, which is why I was so disgusted by the failure of our parliament in London to vote the very minimal thing of asking for an immediate ceasefire and ceasing the supply of arms to Israel, to encourage them to sign that as well.
What do you make of MPs, SNPs, some 56 Labour MPs, 10 from the front bench? You've now lost those jobs on the Labour front bench, most of it, by the way, no one had ever heard of, basically defying Keir Starmer and indeed Conservative policy, which is not to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. They called for a ceasefire. They say that is the humanitarian, the right thing to do. What do you make of that vote?
There was a ceasefire, and it was broken by Hamas on the 7th of October. When they killed 1,400 Israelis and kidnapped 240, when they led to scenes like the one you saw there. I can't stress enough that people in the kibbutz, people in these communities, you see even on the remainders of their house, on their fridge magnets, peace now, live and let live. These were people who wanted to live by their Gazan neighbors, and often cooperated, drove people to hospital. There's a funeral today of an 80-year-old woman who drove Palestinian children to hospitals. She was an Israeli. She was killed by Hamas. Her funeral is today. They couldn't identify the body until just a few days ago. She was so badly burned. I can't stress enough, a ceasefire would return to the situation that led to this. People like that man you just saw me interviewing, he said to me at the end of our interview, he said, I'm a leftist. I've always been a leftist. He said, we cannot live beside these people, by which he and all the others mean we cannot live beside Hamas. Hamas has said that they will do this again and again. There is no way anyone can live beside that. What that looks like, what the defeat of Hamas looks like, we'll see. But a ceasefire is not the answer to that. And anyone who thinks otherwise should come here and learn something.
Hello, YouTube. This is Sadako24 here. Now, you might notice I've done several videos on the Israel-Gaza conflict. The horrific war that is happening. The horrific war that started, of course, with October the 7th. The horrors of October the 7th. So, as you can gather by the two clips I've shown, the situation in this Israel-Gaza war is very bleak and very hopeless. One side says that, peace must prevail, and the other side is, now Jeremy Corbyn is making the case for why this war must end. Douglas Murray makes the case for why this war can't end. It won't end. And a ceasefire is the worst thing that can happen. Now, I'm inclined of the two to agree with Douglas Murray, but I'm obviously not deaf to some of the strength of feeling of Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn would want there to be peace, obviously. But it seems very, very unlikely. It seems unlikely you can get... It seems very naive thinking on Corbyn's part. And for much of this war, I have been behind... I've taken Douglas Murray's side. Take Douglas Murray's position. I've agreed with Douglas Murray's position. Sometimes more out of anger and rage at Hamas than any logical thinking. Determination to see them wiped out for what they did on October the 7th, for what they've done to their own country, what they've done to Israel, for what they are. They're an absolutely evil entity, barbaric entity. And it seems imperative that we have to get rid of evil like that. But, this war has already come at a horrific cost, a rapidly horrific cost of civilians. Is there a way of winning this without all this horrific innocent collateral? Obviously, we can't turn the clock back. If we could turn the clock back, then Israel could have probably done this operation back in 2007 very quickly. When Hamas was far less embedded in Gaza, they could have done it. They could have taken out Hamas and probably would with far less of a civilian death toll. But but Israel waited until this terrible day when Hamas had finally got powerful enough to go this far. And now, of course, as Douglas Murray says, there are people who are leftist in Israel who would have been behind a move to progress, to peace, to a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, to resolve Palestinian grievances, to acknowledge and resolve Palestinian grievances. And this has disillusioned many of them. So the question is there no hope of peace? Are we just going to have to brace ourselves for more war, more killing, more dead Palestinian children until Hamas are wiped out, Well, I'm going to venture a not exactly expert position. I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm going to try and venture what might be a possible third way out of this. A third way out of this hell, if you know what I mean. I'm going to read you an article that it's that's in its own way a harrowing read, but it possibly offers a glimmer of hope for Gaza and Israel. I'm going to read this article. I'm going to start by reading this article. My father is an Imam in Gaza. Hamas kidnapped him for refusing to be their puppet. Last weekend, 20 masked men dragged my father away. His crime? He refused to brainwash his people with their politics. It's an article by Ala Mohammed Mushtaha. Rafah. On Saturday, December the 30th, our front door was busted down and 20 masked men barged in and took my father, widely respected and deeply learned Imam here in Gaza. One dragged him by his head and another grabbed him by his beard. My younger brother tried to intervene and reason with the kidnappers, but they beat him. I have a medical condition which makes it hard for me to breathe, so all I could do was watch as the horror unfolded. I know that if Hamas kills my father, they'll say that the Israeli army did it, but my father was very keen that even if he died, we should make known the despicable demands they make of him. It was his last request to us, literally, as he was being carried out of the door, that should he die, we should publicize the real reason for his death, and it is this. He wouldn't preach what Hamas told him to. He refused to tell Gazans that violent resistance and obedience to Hamas is the best way out of our current hell. This story starts before October the 7th, and even before 2007 when Hamas took control of Gaza. Our family had lived in Gaza for generations. Before 2007, my father worked for the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. After Hamas took over, they forced him out of his position. This was a hard time for my family. My father was the sole breadwinner. Finally, after 3 long years, he came back to work first as a mosque servant, then a mosque guard, then an employee of the ministry, and finally he was appointed as a mosque imam. My father is known throughout the Gaza Strip. He has a doctorate in Sharia from Cairo's storied Al-Azhar University and is well respected by his peers. For Hamas, being Muslim means supporting Hamas, and people who do not support Hamas aren't Muslims. If you don't abide by what Hamas tells you, you'll lose your job or worse. To keep my father in line, ensuring that he would deliver only Hamas-approved Friday sermons and allow Hamas to use his mosque as a clandestine weapons depot, they arrested my brother and me at least 10 times between 2016 and 2019. Sometimes they would speak politely. Sometimes they would ask us to comply for the sake of your sisters. But always the threat of violence loomed in the background, and several times we were beaten and humiliated in front of our father. They beat him too, once nearly blinding him. He was forced to do things for Hamas, move money around, store things, keep their secrets. As an imam, my father keeps the keys to the mosque and is responsible for safeguarding large sums of money that Muslims give as zakat, the mandatory alms giving of our faith. Hamas members would take advantage of his duties and use the mosque to stash money, weapons, and equipment. Sometimes they'd bring a large wrapped-up prayer rug which they said had been donated, except my father wasn't allowed to open the rugs. Only special volunteers were allowed to open them or to transport the rugs in and out. My father had to open and close the doors and allow the sacred space to be used as a warehouse for Hamas. What choice did he have? It is a bitter truth that Hamas thinks of mosques as the property of their regime and that they store weapons there. Once there were big boxes that were marked as food aid. There wasn't food inside, but something made of iron. The most egregious thing Hamas imposed on my father was the content of his Friday sermons. They instructed him to brainwash people with their politics, to stick with Hamas and with the resistance, and that it's the only choice, that those who died fighting would be rewarded with 72 black-eyed virgins, patience, jihad, all of that stuff. Hamas exploits our religion, pretending to be modern-day prophets, likening themselves to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. Nobody told my father there was a plan to attack Israel on October the 7th. There's just this constant overarching message within the mosques. Islamic classes, sermons, and lectures that the resistance, meaning Hamas and only Hamas, is the only way to liberate Alaska and the only way to alleviate our suffering. They do all this brainwashing to make you think the cause of our suffering is Israel. But I see very clearly who causes our suffering. Whereas most aid in Gaza is only accessible to Hamas's loyalists or those who toe the movement's line, my father would collect and distribute zakat alms to those who actually needed it. Some congregants would donate food, furniture, and household goods, and many among Gaza's neediest would come to my father, who would see that they were distributed fairly. My father also strove to give pious Muslims unbiased spiritual guidance, not the propaganda Hamas clerics deliver. We fled our homes in Gaza City on October the 20th, moving from place to place, until settling at my sister's home in Rafah several weeks ago. Her home was bombed as well, and now roughly 40 people, including men and seniors, are sharing space in a building that is partly reduced to rubble. Since the war, Hamas has put enormous pressure on imams to persuade the population that their only choice is the resistance. Schools and universities aren't functioning. The one thing that draws people in is prayer. But now we have reached a time when nearly everyone in Gaza is saying Hamas caused the death of 20,000 people in Gaza and the injury of 50,000 more. So when the group demanded that my father go to a school where thousands of displaced persons are sheltering and urged him to stand with the resistance, to trust Hamas, he flat out refused. My father knows the difference between right and wrong. He knew that refusing to act as a megaphone for Hamas could lead to his death, and yet he refused. He has a clear conscience. So does everyone who knows what really happened to him and why. This time, it's not like the prior wars. This time, people are telling the truth. Before October the 7th, people were afraid. And of course, some people are still afraid. But ironically, when there is fighting, Hamas go underground, and people can be more vocal about how Hamas has ruined our lives. People are starting to publicly violate the laws, rules, dictates, and orders of Hamas. They are openly cursing Hamas and its leaders in the streets and markets, and ignoring the directives of the few Hamas officials and police still above ground. They have caused so much damage. It's undeniable. They've imposed themselves on our society, on my father, for too long. We're all paying the price. People want freedom. We love deeply that this war will end and that Hamas will end with it. I don't know where my father is. I don't know if I will ever see him again alive. My hope in telling this story to the public and putting my name to it is to somehow offer my father a measure of protection. Hamas may wish to release him and show the world that they would never harm an admired mosque preacher. God alone knows the future, but what I know is that under no circumstances would my father want to become a propaganda tool. So there you have it. Sometimes it's hard to gauge a public mood, but it does sound to me as though Hamas is losing the popularity it once enjoyed in Gaza. That the people are fed up of them. That for a long time, the grievance and rage of the people of Gaza has been directed at Israel, but now it seems that the rage is being directed at Hamas, which, let's face it, is where it more properly belongs. I did a video about Jeremy Corbyn, a while ago, in which I talked about why it might have been difficult for him to condemn Hamas on Piers Morgan's show. I still don't quite know the answer to that, but he has always said that, the October the 7th atrocity was wrong, it was horrible. He's always condemned it. Possibly from a point of view saying that it was a lashing out of rage by the people at Israel. And that what Israel is doing in retaliating is just fomenting more bitterness. And, Gaza is going to suffer a hell of a lot. Even when this war ends, it's going to suffer terribly. But this article presents a bitter, a kind of almost pyrrhic hope, shall we say, that the bitterness that has been fermented here is no longer going to be just to Israel, exclusively at Israel. There's going to be bitterness at Hamas by the people, that Hamas has lost popularity. During the war in Syria, which involved ISIS, and the ISIS had control of a huge territory of Syria and Iraq. There were votes for the motion to airstrike them or not. Corbyn was one of those who voted against airstrikes. George Galloway kind of said that he felt that the problem with airstrikes is that they hampered the resistance on the ground. There was the Kurdish resistance, there was the Iraqi army. There were these resistance groups on the ground trying to kill ISIS. And they were saying, look, if you indiscriminate bombing, you're probably going to be killing more the people who are fighting ISIS than ISIS themselves. There is no... ISIS is not any kind of military... they're not a proper government. They don't really have, what you might identify as military targets. They're a very nebulous, fluid group. They'll scatter, they'll move about, they'll survive. They're like rats. They're very adept at surviving in these kind of conflict zones. And the case was, the resistance might be able to take them down in a way that, airstrikes from the air won't. More needed to be done on the ground. And it occurs to me that it might be the case that it could be true here as well. That maybe continuing to bomb Gaza is only making things worse. That if the bombing stopped, then the grievance of the people will fester. They'll be mobilized, and maybe it just might be possible there's going to be an uprising against Hamas, or at least a public rejection of the power of Hamas. And there are always kind of theories about, is there a more cynical reason Israel is going to war in Gaza? Is it just after territory? Is there an ulterior motive? A lot of the left insist that it's an ulterior motive. They say it can't possibly just be about retaliation and taking out Hamas. It's like that they're killing far too many people for it to just be targeted at Hamas. But assuming, of course, that the goal is, a goal that certainly most of Israel would be unanimous on, the elimination of Hamas, is there a possibility that Israel can step back and do nothing, after all, and just leave it to the people of Gaza to take Hamas down themselves? To, uproot them from the way they've embedded themselves? Is it possible there can be peace? Is it possible that Israel can, that if, the movement demanding a ceasefire, if it happens, could it actually be not the worst case scenario? Because that's what everyone that's a large reason why I've opposed the idea of a ceasefire, is because I think it'd be the worst case scenario if Hamas are just able to do another October the 7th or another kind of provocative action again and bring us all back to square one, where the entire war that's been waged so far has ended up being for nothing. The war has started to break my heart again in a big way. It's been harrowing, and as much as I share the sentiments of the author, it is Hamas's fault. It's Hamas that's brought this horror on their people. Hamas won't declare a ceasefire. Hamas won't surrender. But could it just be a matter of time before Hamas loses its popular support? And that Israel needs to do no more. And in fact, if Israel continues to prosecute this war and continues to bomb the people who now feel, have a collective animosity against Hamas, could it be that now it's time to stop? Now it's time for Israel to stop this bombardment. There are many reasons, of course, to want Israel to stop anyway, to stop the death toll. But I mean, there are people in Israel who reacted to October the 7th, and they feel, a lot of them would say that Netanyahu, they no longer have faith in him. They feel that he was incompetent in protecting them. There was sentiment against him anyway. Now there is, of course, the possibility that Israel, if they elect him out, they might elect someone even more right wing than him, because that a lot of people feel that what October the 7th did, it was strengthened the sentiment of the hardline Zionist sentiment of we must destroy our enemies, we must crush our enemies. And even those on the left who used to kind of argue for peace and coexistence, a lot of them are disillusioned now, and they don't know what to believe. They're not sure they believe in peace anymore. Most of the people killed in the kibbutz were left wing, and they were butchered mercilessly. But Israel is probably going to vote out Netanyahu. So, October the 7th caused a cultural shift there. This latest bombardment has been actually unprecedented. This was worse even than the 51-day war back in 2015, and that 51-day war was horrific enough, and it is one that Hamas made gains from. They gained a lot of angry recruits from that war. That bombardment made Hamas kind of stronger, a lot stronger. And But it might be this bombardment has been so horrific that it might actually have the reverse effect. It might be see the people decide that they want nothing to do with Hamas now. They want Hamas gone. They want, Hamas just brought this hell on them. And as much as, some of the left wing in this country continue to valorize Hamas as freedom fighters, some people will always believe that, but it sounds as though a lot of people in Gaza, the actual people in Gaza themselves no longer believe it. They no longer believe the Hamas are their salvation. Now, Israel will not stop this unless they can be sure. And all I'm offering is a naive hope that could be wrong. There could still be enough support for Hamas in Gaza. Hamas might be too powerful still for the people of Gaza to overthrow, especially now the people of Gaza they're very dependent on aid. They're very dependent on, they're undergoing a major, major humanitarian crisis. They certainly might not have the fight in them for this. But it'd be nice to think it'd be possible that this can end without any further military action even needed from Israel. And in fact, this might be an opportunity too good to waste, that maybe, if Israel stops, the sentiment of the people of Gaza might be in alignment with them enough to see Hamas out of power. Or at least see Hamas no longer able to operate the same way. Like Hamas were able to operate this way, partly because of the whisper networks and the popular support. Like they were able to, enough of the population were on their side that they could coordinate their attacks. Sometimes through word of mouth, through the word of mouth of the villages. The way that word spreads in those villages, which is, I think Peter Hitchens said this is probably why they were able to conduct October the 7th, and there was no intelligence on what they were planning, because usually military intelligence depends on studying, electronic communications.
As the Americans discovered in Mogadishu, if your opponent doesn't use electronic means of communication and sends his messages by runner and by word of mouth, then all your most sophisticated satellites and eavesdropping equipment will avail you nothing. People can and do actually completely circumvent that, as they did in Mogadishu in the Great Black Hawk Down incident, many of us will remember. An enemy of this kind is very, very hard to fight. So a lot of the things that are being said are say, well, it's Israel's fault for not having foreseen it. It's Israel's fault for this. It's Israel's fault for that. This is the fault of Hamas, and almost certainly, the Wall Street Journal says
they have brought this on Israel.
The Iranian regime's backing for Hamas, which wants this sort of thing, wants to make the growing development, a quite extraordinary development of diplomatic relations between Israel and countries such as Saudi Arabia. They want to stop that from happening.
And Dubai. And I'm told by people who sort of are considered sources in the Middle East that actually that is what this is all about. It's all about preventing Saudi Arabia making some kind of pact with Israel, preventing the Dubai connection as well, because they know that if that happens, basically Iran will become an isolated country. It will be the only one left, really, which is kind of anti-Israel.
Well, there is that. There's a great grudge match between Iran and Saudi Arabia all the time, in which everybody else involved is a pawn in any case. But yes, these are things. But if anybody's really concerned, and I am, because I've been to the region a lot, and you can't help but like the people there. If you're concerned about the living conditions and the future and hope of the actual population of the region, whether they be Jewish or Arab or Muslim or Christian or whatever it may be, then the last thing you want is more war.
Now, if popular opinion is turned against Hamas, it's a dent to their operational abilities. If the populace aren't going to cooperate with them anymore the same way, then it's a dent. Now, look, I don't like the idea of just waiting and hoping for a light touch approach. I absolutely understand the impulse to just want Hamas finished off, killed properly, immediately. And this is why Israel has been so aggressive about this. That's why there's always been that part of me that's behind it a lot of the time. And then, results aren't happening soon enough. Hamas aren't surrendering, and I just get more and more angry. And I hate feeling that way now. It is a bloodlust, and it always feels worse the morning after. So that's a question. Could peace be possible now? It might be the best possibility. It might be the best option right now. Trust in the people, maybe. It's just an idea. It's just a hope.
Gaza could be, if only its government turned in the direction of peace and prosperity. Gaza could be like Dubai. It's a wonderful position where it is economically and for many other purposes. Attempts have been made by some of the more enlightened Arab governments to, for instance, build good quality new housing there. Yeah. The problem is every time this sort of thing happens, Hamas provokes as hard as it possibly can Israel into bombing attacks, and much of this is destroyed, and the atmosphere of tension and violence is maintained. I've had very good cafe latte in a beachfront cafe in Gaza and eaten extremely good beef stroganoff in a restaurant there. There are shopping malls. There is life there, but it's constantly interrupted by the mad fanatic politics of the Hamas government, which runs it, and all this breeds is fear.
Nobody wants to rule the Gaza. The Israelis used to be in charge of it. They left, as I say, in 2005 to the last Jew. They were all taken out of their houses. Israel doesn't want to rule the Gaza. Now, who can rule the Gaza? Hamas clearly cannot, because they set it up as a terrorist statelet. Can some Fatah-like authority be encouraged to take it over? Possibly. Possibly. I spoke to one Palestinian analyst earlier today who said that actually, just as I said earlier, that an election in the West Bank today would elect Hamas, perhaps an election tomorrow, if it was to happen, and I'm not sure if that's going to be a good idea, might even actually elect not Hamas Palestinians to power. But it's a heck of a risk. The reality is that the only solution to Gaza that anyone can see, I can imagine, is that it has to be a solution which involves multiple players in the region. The question of the Gaza is a very complex question. It used to be ruled by Egypt, used to be run by Egypt. Can Egypt have a role? In my view, it has to have a role. Can Jordan be involved? In my view, yes, it has to have a role. Can the Gulf states, including those who've been pumping money to Hamas, have some kind of role? Yes, I would hope so. It cannot be Israel's task alone to deal with the question of the Gaza. It has to involve multiple players in the region, but there's one kicker to that, which is that none of the Arabs in this region that I'm sitting in care a jot about the Palestinians. They really do not. If they did, for all of their talk, they would have done something. They would not have decided to keep the Palestinians out, as they have in country after country. Queen Rania can invite the Gazans into Jordan. She can invite the West Bank Palestinians into Jordan. She doesn't. Egypt could open its border with Gaza. It doesn't. The Egyptian border with Gaza is firmer and more closely locked than the Israeli ones. There are Gazan workers who, until the atrocities of October the 7th, every day were going through the Eretz crossings and others to work in Israel and to earn a decent living. Were there workers going in daily into Egypt? No, because the Egyptians don't want Palestinians in their country. So the only solution is a regional one, but I'm afraid in this region there are very few people who care about the Palestinians.